So I love those two readings that Kelsey did for us, and it's amazing we're on the same track. So those readings that she composed or read were the ability to see God in the most unlikeliest places. And so for the third reading this morning, I want to read an essay I wrote myself way back in May of 2013. I was in vacation in Ireland and staying at my brother's house, and I was on the flat roof of his garage looking out over a field and had a vision of God in a muddy puddle in the middle of the field. Here's what it looked like. It's the kind of lazy, sunny Irish day that facilitates time travel. All of the sights and sounds conspire to dance me between the 1950s and 2013. They are not so much flashbacks as meanderbacks. There is no hurry, no sudden movements, and no motion sickness. It's much more like multiple memories overlaid on the screen of my perception, which didn't need to displace each other, but rather to weave a tapestry of a timeless now. 11 white cows and one little speckled calf are lying in a field pleasurably chewing the cud. They had been busily chopping the grass, but are now revisiting this earlier meal in a leisurely fashion. Occasionally, one will roll over on its side so that its long tongue can lick its shoulder. I hear their contented sighing. In the distance, a conscientious dog is barking vociferously in reaction to wind-borne auditory and olfactory signals from would-be invaders. I imagine him patriotically patrolling the perimeter of his patron's premises, prophylactically protecting it. A magpie is squawking noisily as she overflies me, warning her mate of my proximity. He is perched 60 feet up in a great ash tree. Her outstretched wings end in white fan-like feathers that stroke the air as she dips and rises in the sine wave of her seesaw flight style. A week of heavy rains has created puddles of various sizes. From the flat roof of Seamus's new workshop, I gaze down upon one of them. It has an irregular shape and is about 6 feet across at its widest point. On Thursday last, when it was full of fresh rain, two of my grandnephews, Malcolm and Mink, who are half Irish, half Dutch, made quite a splash in it. They're both 2 years old, and nothing warms the heart of a 2-year-old boy like the prospect of getting really wet and really muddy in such a puddle. Gratefully, their mothers, Deirdre Og and Aisling, recognize that messy clothes is a very small price to pay for such an ecstatic experience. So the boys are allowed to indulge their fantasies with wild abandon. Yesterday and today have been really sunny, so the puddles are in slow retreat. In Swahili, there is a distinction between uparawa tajiri, a rich man's baldness, and uparawa maskini, a poor man's baldness. One starts from the forehead and works its way backwards. The other starts at the crown of the head and advances simultaneously in all directions. But for the life of me, I can't remember which is which, no matter. This puddle is employing both kinds as it shrinks because it is simultaneously retracting its entire perimeter while also uncovering and growing a small island, a clod of earth, in the center. The sun must have a very strong immune system, for it laps up the bracken liquid without any health consequences. A swallow is doing acrobatics about me, darting daringly. It is the nearest thing I know to an extraterrestrial craft, because it makes a series of orthogonal changes in direction that defy human aviation. Without throttling back even a little, it skims the puddle top, snatching an insect off the surface, leaving not even a ripple in its wake. A white, fluffy cloudlet is wiping the sweat off the sun's fiery face, and the resulting shadow turns the puddle into a perfect mirror. I can see the reflection of a whitethorn bush, cut creatively by the irregularly shaped frame of the profile of the puddle. The water is so still that I can see the blossoms on the twigs of the whitethorn. In the puddle are insects and algae, the flora and the fauna of Mother Nature, who specializes in improv theater. She has never met a challenge that she didn't find inspiring. In the space of this simple little puddle, God's great cosmic symphony is fractally displayed as a hologram called life. These are words inspired by God. So the theme I'd chosen for July was, is life a dream or a simulation? And is God a dream or a simulation? And so on July 6th, I focused on the dream question, whether life and God are dreams. And on July 13th, last week, I focused on the simulation question. So today, because it's the third Sunday, I'm going to do a recap of the two and then open it up to a question and answer. And I want to just preface it by saying once more, when I speak of God, I'm speaking only of the immanence of God, because of God's transcendence, we can only say neti neti, not this, not that. God is not X, God is not Y. And so when I speak about God, I'm talking about the way in which God reveals himself through manifestation. So the first question, I asked myself a whole series of questions over the last few months about this theme. And the first one was, who is God? You know, when I think about God, the Trinity of persons. So in Hinduism, you have Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. In the Buddhist tradition, you have Buddham Saranam Gacchami, Dharmam Saranam Gacchami, Sangam Saranam Gacchami. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the teaching, I take refuge in the community. And in the Christian section, we have God as Father, Son, and Spirit. The God who is, the God who knows completely who he is, and the God who loves completely what she finds herself to be. Now, I have an idea that, you know, these are templates that we overlay upon our experiences of God. So for me, sometimes, rather than a trinity, I think of God as a quaternity, that there are four aspects to it. So it's like an X in some senses, and the top part of the X has to do with God's transcendence, and the bottom has to do with God's immanence. So in the transcendent part, you have a male aspect and a female aspect, and in the bottom, you have a male aspect and a female aspect. So perhaps for the transcendence, we can say God as Father and God as Sophia. And in the immanent, we can talk about Christus and Christa consciousness. So for me, sometimes looking at it as a quaternity gives me more insights than just thinking of it as a trinity. So the notion then of the idea that God is a trinity of persons, or there are persons contained in God. And this was a mistake that happened because of the evolution of our thinking. And so in the great councils beginning in the 3rd and 4th centuries, they talked about God as, they talked about prosopon. The Greek word they use is prosopon, when they talk about aspects of the divine. And prosopon in Greek is the word for a mask. So when an actor came on stage in Greek theater, he would wear a mask to indicate what kind of a character he was going to portray. So if the mask looked like this, there's going to be a comedy. If it looked like that, there's going to be a tragedy. And so the prosopon was simply the mass where we experienced the divine. Now, when that got translated into Latin, it went from prosopon to persona. And when you think about persona, it means to sound out through. So again, it's a mask. You've got a mask with a space for the eyes and a space for the mouth. So you're sounding out through the mask. So persona, you're making sounds through the mask. But unfortunately, this word then became personality as distinct. And so that the notion that personality then distinguishes me from other people. But for me, personality is simply the interface of essence with environment, the interface of soul and circumstance. So when you put the same soul in different circumstances, you get a different personality emerging. And the circumstances, you know, have to do with the mission you came for, has to do with the 7 levels of your body, has to do with the family into which you parachuted, the culture and the era and the time that you came. So the circumstances determine the personality that emerges, but the soul is eternal. So the question I asked then of myself was, does God dream? I want to know, is the cosmos actually a dream that God is having? And I remember years and years and years ago, I was on tour in Germany, you know, and I was asked this question. And what I said was that life is a dream that the ego is having. And the ego is a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is a dream that the spirit is having. And spirit is a dream that God is having. So yes, in some senses, I believe, you know, that, you know, life itself is a dream, and that God is the dreamer, that God is constantly dreaming new circumstances into manifestation. And so I asked myself the question then, is God just entertaining himself as a defense against the loneliness of being the only one? So if there is only God, then no relationships are possible. And if no relationships are possible, no experiences are possible. And so in some senses, is God simply entertaining himself in order to kind of dissipate the loneliness of being the only one? And then I asked about nightmares. Does God have nightmares? If God is dreaming, are there times when God has nightmares? And I remember a group in a Malaysian culture called the Senoi, and they're a dream culture. And every morning when they come down to breakfast, they talk about the dreams they had during the night. So during breakfast, they're sharing their dreams. And they teach their children how to dream lucidly, and particularly if a child reports, kind of a nightmare, they ask the child to go back into the dream tonight and confront the monster, and reach out your hand and ask the monster, what gift is it bringing? So for them, a nightmare is an invitation to face the demons and to ask the demons what actually is the insight that they're coming to bring. So I asked then, does God then have nightmares? And then kind of facetiously, if God has nightmares, are we the monsters in God's nightmares, the ways we behave? So are we dimensions or characters in this nightmare of God? And are God's nightmares how God wrestles with his own shadow? Because if there's a Lucifer, a light being, and an Ahriman, a darkness, are these the elements of God's shadow work? And God is working out through these, learning to face his own demons. So is a nightmare then a struggle between light and dark for us and for God? And then I spoke about the notion of lucid dreaming. Lucid dreaming is where when you're dreaming, you become aware that you are dreaming, and then you can take control of where the dream is headed and move it in any direction you want. And so the next question I asked was, is creation how God turns lucid dreams into a cosmos? So when God dreams lucidly and is aware that she's dreaming, does she then direct it and turn this creative endeavor into a brand new cosmos? And I asked myself the question, does God have false awakenings? A false awakening is where you wake up, you think you've woken up for a dream, but you're still actually in another dream. And I shared the story of about 20 years ago, here in my home, I went to bed at night in Healdsburg and had a dream. And in the dream, I found myself back in my mother's house in Cork in Ireland. And we were talking, having food, and then I went to bed in Cork. And I fell asleep and I had a dream. And in that dream, I felt I was back in Kenya in my last mission, a place called Kipsaraman. And the dream went on, I'm in Kipsaraman, interacting with everybody. And then I wake up and I realize I'm not in Kenya. I'm in my mother's house in Cork in Ireland. And then I wake up a second time and I realize I'm not in Cork in Ireland, I'm in Healdsburg. So this is called false awakening. So they're the levels of the dream. So the question I asked then, is each lower dimension a false awakening? And am I falsely awake, right? Is this a false awakening right now? As I'm speaking to a putative audience out there, is this a false awakening? That I'm still caught in a dream? And the answer for me is absolutely. That there are various levels of the dream, and the three-dimensional density of the dream is the lowest form whatsoever. And so at some stages, I wake up and I realize that, what I see around me is only part of the dream, and I aspire to go to a higher and to identify with higher levels of the dream. So then I asked myself, how did we get to this place? And here I've talked many times about what I call the 5 L's. Love, light, logos, life, and laughter. And I asked myself these questions. Is God using love in order to create light? And is God using light in order to create matter? And is God using logos to create form from matter? And is God using life to create stories about forms? And finally, is God using laughter to dissolve his own nightmare? So there's a whole bunch of questions there for me and for you, if they're of interest to you, to ponder these things. So then I look at what I consider the co-creative kind of relationship between ourselves and God. Because initially, long before time, in fact, there is only God. So there are no relationships, and therefore no experience is possible, and therefore divine loneliness. And so then the image of God fractures into whole holographic fractals of itself. And a hologram is an entity that contains the totality of itself in every one of its component parts. And a fractal is a pattern that repeats at an infinite number of scales. So according to the Kabbalah, for instance, God self-fractures into netzotzotz, sparks of the divine, which I would call souls. So I believe then, had a vision 3 or 4 years ago, where God called all of these souls together and they decided on a project. And the project was to co-create a cosmos and enjoying being observers of it. So we created the entire cosmos and we were in what Buddhism would call turiya, witnessing consciousness. We're watching this co-creation and we're in awe of what we've just done. And then at some stage, God calls a second conference and we decide, God and the souls, to create avatars in multiple dimensions so as to become participants in the cosmos. So we're now in a state called turiyatita, according to Buddhism, which is the ability to be both a witness and a participant, what cultural anthropology will call participant observers. So not only have we co-created the cosmos, now we've embedded ourselves into it and we're experiencing it from the inside as well as the outside. Now, then the game of hide and go seek was invented to test how far from source and with a limited memory we could venture and still find our way home. And that's the entire objective of our Earth Safari. With very, very limited memory and very, very limited brain power, can we still remember? Can we play hide and go seek with God and find our way back? Now, gratefully, there's a safety harness built into this. When we jumped out of that plane in order to kind of land on planet Earth, there was a safety harness. And the safety harness for me is the bifurcation of Atman and Jiva. In the Hindu model, Atman is that the part of the soul that never leaves the side of God, and Jiva is the part that volunteers for incarnation. So Atman is the observer and Jiva is the participant. And so the pre-incarnate and the incarnate facets of the soul create a safety harness. So Atman is constantly feeding insights and synchronicities into Jiva so we don't lose our way completely. I went on then to talk about a diagram which I drew many, many, many years ago as a result of a dream I had. And I got up and I sketched it, just freehand. And in this dream, there was the sun shining on a sealed room. And there was a tiny portal in one wall of that room. And the sun ray came through it, and then it split into multiple rays. And each single ray met a prism that split it into the 7 colors and projected them onto the opposite wall. And as I began to think about it, here was the message that was coming through for me. That the sun represents source itself. And the sunshine represents love. And the wall is the boundary between the transcendence of God and the immanence of God. And the portal, the little skylight, is the Holy Spirit. And the Spirit allows the love of God to shine through into the container. And then it's split into single rays as it comes through. And these are the individual souls. And each soul meets a prism. And the prism is the launching pad where we decide to incarnate into a particular dimension. And then the prism scatters the light into 7 colors. And these colors are seen on the screen. And they represent for me the different levels of body or self-identification. So red represents for me then the physical body. Orange represents the etheric elan vital. Yellow represents the astral body. Green represents the mental body. Blue represents the psychic body. And then indigo is about re-encountering and re-identifying with the soul self. And violet is about re-encountering spirit and going back out through the portal and merging totally with source itself, with Godhead or Parabrahma. So then I asked, how do we go home? You know, if that's how we arrived, how do we go home? And I believe then that altered states of consciousness are the portals through which souls explore different densities of apparent separation from source. And then ascension is a fractal individual culture. It goes all the way from what individuals do, to cultures, to species, to the planet, to the solar system, to the galaxy, to the universe, to parallel universes. So everything is an ascension process on a fractal level. And so when I was in Kenya and people would ask me, what is the kingdom of heaven that Jesus speaks about? And in Swahili, I would say, Mbinguni si mahali, bali ni hali. And you can hear the alliteration even if you don't speak Swahili. Mbinguni si mahali, bali ni hali. And translated means heaven is not a place, it's a state of consciousness. So that's what I had to say 2 Sundays ago when I asked the question, is life a dream and is God dreaming? Then last Sunday I picked up on the notion of is God assimilation or is life assimilation? So I'm shifting now from God and life as a dream to God and life as assimilation. And I posited the following. Imagine I were to write a novel. And in this novel, some of the characters are in a deep philosophical debate about esoteric ideas. And one of the esoteric ideas they're debating about is whether or not they're real, or are they simply figments of somebody's imagination. So I've created this novel, I've created these characters, and these characters are in dialogue, and they feel really real to themselves, but they're debating, are we real, or are we simply figments of somebody's imagination? So what's the answer to that? In some senses, they're assimilation. I've created them. But they think that they're real because they can have this dialogue about whether or not they're real. So I asked then, do we, in waking life, does the fact that we can have such a debate mean that we are ontologically real, that every single one of us is real? Or are they actually a creation of God, assimilation of God? So are we real? Does the fact that we can ponder that question mean that we are real? Or that this is merely the plot of a novel, or assimilation? And if so, who wrote the novel? Or who engineered the simulation? So that led me to the discussion of the phenomenon of observation. And what I've seen is this, that there are stages in the evolution of our ability to observe. Firstly, as little children, we see things as we are. As a little child, I see things as I am. As grown-ups, we see things as the culture tells us they are. As we begin to awaken, we see things as they really are. And as fully awakened beings, we see things as God sees them. So they're the 4 stages of observation for me. As a little child, I see things precisely as I am. As a grown-up, I see what the culture tells me is real. As I begin to awaken, I begin to see things as they really are in themselves. And if I were to get fully awakened, I would see things as God sees them. And that was the great message of the Buddha when he held the flower aloft. And people are gazing and wondering, what is he going to say about the flower? And the realization was that if you really see a flower, you see everything. Because as Thich Nhat Hanh so beautifully said, a flower consists completely of non-flower elements. If you were to take away the soil and the sun and the wind and the rain and the nutrients in the soil, there wouldn't be a flower. So a flower consists completely of non-flower elements. So then what's important is not so much where we look as how we look. If we know how to look, it doesn't really matter where we look because we'll see everything. If we don't know how to look, it doesn't matter how many places we look, we won't find anything. And we have this effect in the observer effect in quantum mechanics, a double slit experiment. So it's the observation that determines whether light acts as a wave or as a particle. And I believe that the greatest temptation for us as human beings is to only see things as the culture tells us they are. And then you have to brutalize your own unique mission into a socially assigned role. That's the problem with the greatest temptation. So in this simulation then, the next question I asked myself, who are the characters in this dream? So the word that Hinduism uses for this game of life is called Laila. So is Laila a simulation whereby God entertains herself? And if so, all dimensions at all levels are characters in God's simulation. And I believe that whenever a character in the simulation awakens, then God begins to awaken. Whenever a character in my novel begins to ask the question, am I real? Or am I a figment of somebody's imagination? That character already has ontological reality and begins to awaken. And you have this beautiful intersection set of 2 circles, the vesica piscis, the intersection of light and dark, the intersection of Lucifer and Ahriman. And it's in this intersection that Christ's conscience is being born in this game, in this novel, in this simulation. And then that brought me to the notion of what then is the dance of life. So I believe that Christ consciousness is the permanent awareness of the inner divinity of all creatures. And it is the birthright of all incarnated beings. Christ consciousness is not just meant for the elect. It's the birthright of all incarnated beings. It's only a question of how seriously are we going to take the work of discovering that level of ourselves. But in the game of hide and go seek, brave souls volunteer to temporarily separate themselves from source in order to experience the heart-sobbing nostalgia for home. That's why we do it. In order to really understand the nostalgia, what happens when we're separated from source or from home. It's like if you've done any acting, you find yourself in the green room at the end of the dream drama in which all the actors have played their parts in the improv theater of earth life. But now you're in the green room. The play has finished for the night. You may repeat it tomorrow night, but it's finished for tonight. You put on your street clothes and you go home to your family. And what does science, what does the mystical science say about this dance? And there's so many different levels of science that you could use to illustrate this. So for instance, when we create a simulation, we're doing it all the time, we use Boolean algebra, zeros and ones. So the screen you're looking at right now, your TV screen or your phone screen, whatever, is a display, it's a matrix of pixels. And whether they're on or off, zeros or ones, they're going to create pictures and sounds. So we create a simulation just using Boolean algebra, simply just on and off, zeros and ones. That's simple. Go up a step and you look at, for instance, in biochemistry or biology, the nucleotides. And so all genetical manifestation is the result of the interplay of A, C, T, and G. So DNA is the data, the printout of the physical body, and DNA is turning into information. Is turned into information by the gene sequencing. So again, you have four elements, that simulate life. You go up another notch and you get the 7 notes in music. All of Tchaikovsky and all of music is basically reworking 7 notes. So from this very, very simple beginning, you create all music. And the final one, if you take the English language with the 26 letters of the alphabet, all English literature comes from it. Everything Shakespeare has ever written is a combination of 26 letters. So we are in this dance of data versus information, whether it's in words or mathematical formula. And finally, I believe that this leads to the crescendo of a singularity and an asymptote. So when a graph goes asymptotic, imagine you have just a simple graph with an x-axis and a y-axis. And x represents time and y represents change over time. So if you a graph of that, if it's the same amount of change in the same amount of time, you get a straight line. But what happens if the graph begins to curl upwards? And so you're getting more and more change in shorter and shorter time periods, until finally you get infinite change over 0 time. And then it has got asymptotic and there's a singularity. Now I believe that black holes in space are singularities, are portals where the dance enters into other dimensions. So the graph has climbed so quickly, that changes happen so quickly, that there's a black hole in space, a singularity, and there's a brand new universe at the other side. And I believe actually that the Big Bang came from a singularity in a previous configuration or a previous cosmos. So how do we do this dance with God? So again, there's the distinction between the transcendence and the immanence. Source is the Godhead. In Hinduism, they'll call it Parabrahma, or I would call it Father, or the transcendent. And then the spirit is Brahma, or the mother, or Sophia. And so when we dance with God, we're dancing with these different elements. So the Logos, then the Christ, is the perfect template or the kind of prototype of the game. The Christ consciousness is the origin of the game, the purpose of the game, and the destination of the game. So the very first relationship then, I believe, is between God's transcendence, which Eckhart would call the Godhead, or what Hinduism would call Parabrahma. So it's the relationship between God's transcendence and God's immanence. The relationship between Godhead and God, between Parabrahma and Brahma. That's the very first relationship. Then the Spirit is the portal that initiated and sustains this relationship. And then an exquisite, complex dance begins between every 2 souls. There are billions and billions of souls all over. Everything is a soul. But if you just had even 2 souls, each soul has 2 facets. There's Atman, the portion of the soul that never leaves the side of God, and then Jiva, the part that volunteers for incarnation. And so each soul has 2 aspects, Atman and Jiva. And these have 5 different relationships. So the first relationship is to source itself. The second relationship is the disincarnate soul self, or Atman, to its incarnated ego self, or Jiva. That's the second relationship between Atman and Jiva of the same soul. The third relationship is between the disincarnate soul self, the Atman, to a disincarnate soulmate, the Atman of another soul. And then the fourth relationship is the incarnated ego self, the Jiva, to the incarnated soulmate, 2 human beings walking together as soulmates. And the fifth relationship is the incarnated ego self, the Jiva, to the disincarnated soulmate at the other side. So we've got these 5 relationships, even if there are 2 souls involved. But the truth is, each soul has an infinitude of relationships with every word of God. We're related to every atom, to every rock, to flora, to fauna, to angelic forces of light and dark. We're connected to all of these. And this is the extraordinary dance of the cosmos. So that finally, when we awaken to this reality, we can listen to Jesus at the Last Supper, when the awakened souls who were listening to him heard Jesus say, I and the Father are one. To really see me is to see the Father. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.
This is the second time I've heard you say this, and so I want to. Music doesn't just have 7 notes. Indian music, African music, gospel singers, they sing they have multiple notes that aren't in the Western canon. And so I like to think about, it reminds me, and so it's a multiplicity of sounds. It's a multiplicity of reflecting the multiplicity of Christ consciousness is what I like to think about. When I was listening to Kelsey reading her poem and also the other reading, I was thinking about, there's her idea or the writer's idea, and then as you're listening, God speaks to you, and then it becomes something else more. Just, it becomes all of the universe, all the flora and fauna, everything. And so I don't want to limit myself to 7 notes. I want symphony.
Good observation, Margaret. So, in Irish music, it's a pentatonic scale. There are only 5 notes in Celtic music. You're absolutely right. So different musical systems have different numbers. But the important point I'm trying to make is that with a very limited number of possibilities, you can create an infinitude of outcomes. So thanks
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Seán.
Sure.
After the first session, I wrote you a short email with a question in it, which I've been asking repeatedly when you asked us to ask questions of ourselves. And the question is why we ask God for anything. And my presumption has been, or assumption has been, that God is everything and nothing, and gave us everything, including his own incarnation in Jesus Christ, to show us exactly the way that we needed to behave in order to return to Godhead. So he's given us everything we need. And isn't the act of asking a confirmation that we lack, and B, a confirmation that we are separate from that from whom we are asking something? And if I were God, it's kind of like paying to go to a college class, not really attending all the classes or paying attention that well, or reading all the material, and then sitting down for the final exam and asking the professor, who's given you everything you need to get an A+, to sit beside you and help you answer all the questions on the final exam. It almost seems ungrateful to ask for that which has already been given.
Okay, they're very profound questions, Tom. So let me use just kind of images. So you're absolutely right. When we're fully awakened beings, we realize that there is only God. But the truth is that then God decides to play a game in which she self-fractures in order to generate experiences. And part of the experience is to experience what it's like to be separated from source. So imagine you're kind of a diver, with scuba gear, and you go out in a boat into the ocean, and you put on your wetsuit and your oxygen tank, and you jump over, and there's this big tube connecting you to the boat. Now, as you're down examining the sea floor, you have control over your movements, but the air is being supplied to you through the tube or through the backpack that you're wearing. And without that, you die really, really quickly. So there has to be some connection to source. Now, if we limit ourselves, then we're dependent upon the source of that power. And so part of the agreement we make is that in order to generate experiences for God, there must be the possibility of experiencing separation from source. Otherwise, we cannot distinguish between right and wrong, between pain, and light, between, the self and the other. And so the agreement to experience separation is a hugely important part of the journey, because only through that can actually God generate experiences for herself. And so if we knew that we were God and we would never ask questions of anything, we'd saunter through life learning nothing and experiencing nothing. We just have this to use another image, suppose you were playing golf and somehow you got a guarantee that no matter how badly you hit the ball off the tee, you'd score a hole in one every time, even if the fairway is 400 yards long, that every time you hit the ball, it will wind up, in the hole every time. How many games of golf would you want to play? You'd be bored out of your mind after 9 or 10 rounds. And so the fact that we can't determine what the consequence of any shot is, it means we have to learn from the ways in which we're holding the club. And so it's about the incarnated aspect of the soul, the jiva aspect, learning to become more and more fused with the Atman, and Atman with source itself. So there are stages of the game of the enlightenment, where gradually we begin to realize more and more that there is no separation. But in order to realize there is no separation, we first have to experience separation. And so when Christ is asking, you will receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened. That's part of the journey, that you have to ask, you have to knock, and you have to seek. And only then will the enlightenment process begin to take over your psyche, until finally you get to a place like an enlightened being, where you realize that there is only God. And then the ego is gone at the stage. But in order to participate in the game, you have to accept limitation and separation. Otherwise, there is no game.
I think I had a bit of a realization, which is also, when you do have those, as soon as you have them, you're like, you feel a little like the apostles with Jesus. Right? But I wonder if you could speak to this. I don't know if everyone's had this experience, but sometimes I will have the experience that far exceeds my current stage of consciousness. Right? And so it occurred to me, oh, okay, then it's terrifying a lot of the time, right? Because, my little brain, sometimes I'll fall back to, I think, the little kid consciousness, A lot of times I'm where the culture is telling me how I should see things. I'm like right in there. I can play that game really well. But if I'm there and I have an experience of consciousness that is above or ascends or beyond in some way what I am prepared to understand, right? I mean, it tells me a couple of things. One, I got some work to do, right? Two, I scramble, right, to find my seat. Right? I got to find God because I can't handle this. Or I at least have to find my soul to talk to, little Barbara and the soul having a convo. Sometimes I forget and I can't get there, I mean, it's not like it happens every day, but I wonder if you could speak to that, because for the first time it hit me that the stages of consciousness that I tend to think of as ascending, they're a little bit fluid. I mean, it's not like you graduate and then you get to go to the next grade and you stay there and then you get to go to the next. And I just wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, and if you have, any good practice advice for what to do when we find ourselves in that situation, if that makes sense.
Brilliant. And so let me make two responses to that, Barbara. The first one comes from Hinduism. And Hinduism reminds us that the siddhis, which are kind of like psychic gifts, like clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, precognition, telepathy, psychokinesis, these kind of things, that they may occur on the journey of enlightenment. But Hinduism says, do not get attached to the siddhis. There are distractions. They're not evidence of enlightenment. They're simply stuff that goes around with the terrain, so not get attached to them. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that if you look at the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, where I just mentioned to Tom, there's the ask and you shall receive, seek and you shall find, knock and the door will be opened. Thomas has a very different version of that, where he says it happens in 6 stages. The Gnostic Gospel of Thomas. He says, those who seek should not stop searching until they find, stage 2. And when they find, they will be disturbed, stage 3. And when they are disturbed, they will marvel. And when they marvel, they will rule. And when they rule, they will rest. So they're the 6 stages according to Thomas. So let me try to unpack that a little bit for myself. So there are a lot of people who are seekers and they're interested in spirituality and they set out on the journey. And at some stage, if they're dedicated to it, they will find something. But guaranteed, if what they will find will really, really disturb them. Particularly if you come from a very orthodox or fundamentalist mindset in any group, whether it's a Christian group or a Muslim group or Hindu group or whatever, once you find the new light, you're going to be really disturbed because now your personal cosmology just took a knockout blow. And for many people, they'll retreat to the safety of the fundamentalist previous viewpoint. And this is true of everything, not just the spiritual journey. It's true in politics, it's true in economics, it's true in everything. That when you launch out to find a better way, and you find a better way, you're going to be disturbed. Because now everything that you felt was grounded, you realize it was an illusion, that it was Maya. So most people will turn back at that stage and retreat back to Mother Church. Now, when you continue, the next stage is you will marvel. You begin to see for the first time, oh my God, I was living in illusion. I was putting the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together in a wrong fashion. And this is an image I like to use a lot. If you trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle, the first thing you have to realize as you tumble the pieces out of the box is this. Everything that's necessary is there. And everything that's there is necessary. But our experience is that as we begin to assemble a jigsaw puzzle, at some stage you get to a place where there are 5 holes left in the jigsaw puzzle and there's 45 pieces left on the side, and no matter where you try to put them, they won't fit. And then you come to the awful realization, oh my God. It means that there are some parts I've assembled wrongly right now. I forced them together because the contours matched, but the picture is not emerging. So I have to kind of disassemble parts of the jigsaw and then reassign them to different places. And if I do that correctly, eventually there'll be no holes left and no pieces left over. And that's the journey of enlightenment over many, many, many incarnations. So I have to get to a place where I realize, okay, the awful place, the awful realization that what I'm discovering now tells me that what I've been in the past wasn't actually spirituality. I wasn't real spirituality. And now do I have the courage to disassemble parts of what I put together and begin to reassemble the pieces. And actually, I think I mentioned last week that this idea won a Nobel Prize for a guy called Ilya Prigogine in 1977. He was a Russian-Belgian biochemist who came up with a theory called dissipative structures. And it was the solution to an ancient, scientific conundrum. And the conundrum is this, that if the second law of thermodynamics is true, that all closed systems left to their own devices run themselves down into chaos. You put a cup of coffee on the table and go away for an hour, you come back, it's tepid. Or you put your bicycle outside in the rain during the winter, you come back, it's all rusted. So all closed systems left to their own devices run themselves down into chaos. But at the same time, more and more complex life forms are emerging. And what he showed and demonstrated in his laboratory with crystals is that you don't have to add anything or subtract anything. It's by merely disassembling and reconfiguring that the more complexity evolves. And so that's the journey of spirituality. It's the journey of realizing, being in wonder and marveling at the fact that by recombining the elements, now the fifth stage, then he says, now you will rule. And it's not that you have dominion over anybody else, but that you're the mistress of your own journey. And then finally you will rest, that you found home, and now you stay in the home. But that's a multi-incarnational journey. And the last part of your question then, how do you kind of help that process? And there are lots of different ways of doing that, obviously. Meditation is one. For some people, plant medicine. For some people, spending time with little children. For some people, being out in nature. For some people, it's mathematics. our Mariology, devotion to Mother Mary, our music. So there are very many ways in which people access that kind of heightened awareness.
The image of the vesica Piscis as Christ consciousness. I see that and I feel that. And what I see in that is it feels really small. It feels really small for the reality that most humans are living in, for themselves and for their external. And so then I wonder, is it a pipe dream? If we're living in this dream or simulation and all of this with false awakenings, why is Christ consciousness, why is that vesica Piscis, with as many times as we've heard these stories, as long as the Bible's been around, as long as spirituality's been around, as long as, why is the vesica Piscis not so much bigger? And then, and so like in my head, it's like, well, because it's not the right time. We're just not there yet. Patience. But because as that vesica Piscis gets bigger, I mean, then we become the unified. Those two circles are merged into that one. And I get that that's not the point of being a human. The point of being the human is to dance back and forth. And I am really ready for that vesica Piscis of Christ consciousness to be experienced more and more, so that the generalization of heaven on earth can be experienced by more people. And so it's a comment and a question, and I don't know if it's the why or the how or whatever, but that's what I have. That's what's on my heart and my mind.
So I hope this isn't too personal a question. Are you a mother?
Please. No.
Okay. You know mothers.
I do.
Do you know any mother with a 6 foot tall son?
I do.
Where did he come out of?
Exactly. Okay. Her vesica Piscis.
There we go. And so it literally is, for me, the vulva is a vesica Piscis. Mm-hmm. And this is the birth canal that gives birth to every single human being. And so it's kind of the initiation rite of a soul to incarnate in the womb of a mother, and then to expand, and then finally to enter the birth canal. And there's going to be labor pains for the mother. But now you're looking at a 6 foot tall giant of a guy that came out of this little birth canal. And so if there were a bigger birth canal, in some senses, the process of giving birth might be easier, but in some senses, the reward would be less. If you could just pop out a baby at will, no effort on anybody's part, we wouldn't appreciate motherhood like we appreciate it. And so part of the journey is that we're giving birth to a new stage of human consciousness. I call it Homo spiritualis. And I like the work of a guy called Stan Grof. I don't know if you've come across Stan Grof. Mm. He was a Czechoslovakian psychiatrist who came to this country many years ago. And he did a lot of research with LSD before it was outlawed. But then he developed a system called the perinatal matrices. And he believes that there are 4 significant stages in the birth process when the mother's about to give birth. And the first stage is that the contractions have begun. So the walls are coming in, the roof is coming down, the floor is coming up, and the baby can't escape. The birth canal isn't still open. And so it's being crushed together. That's the first stage. And what he says is that subsequent neurotic behavior in adults is related to the difficulties of various stages of the birthing process. And so the first stage is the contractions have begun, but the doorway isn't opened for the escape. The second stage is now that, it's engaged in the birth canal and it's, really, really struggling to get through. And then at some stage it comes out, and the fourth stage then the umbilical cord is cut. So it's like the 4 stages of the birthing process, each having its own level of trauma, depending on where the difficulty was for the baby and for the mother. Now, I like to extend that to the world right now. I think there's a vesica Piscis opening up on planet Earth in order to give birth to what I call Homo spiritualis, which is the next stage of human evolution. And there are stages after that. There'll be Homo mysticus after that, and there'll be Homo Christus after that, and Homo Deus, finally, when we merge with Source. But in the meantime, we're meant to experience the growth in utero, and to experience the contractions and experience the birth canal, so that we can appreciate the gift of life and the extraordinary sacrifices that mothers make in order to bring new life into the world. So who are the mothers at this stage? The mothers are the light workers. The mothers are the midwives and the doulas at this stage are the people who are already awake and are trying to waken up the rest of us and try to kind of be ready to kind of ease the delivery process and tell us when to work with the contractions, you know, not to push when there are no contractions, but to work with the contractions. So to be able to read the signs of our times and respond accordingly. And I think there are light workers at both sides of the veil, disincarnate entities and incarnated avatars who are guiding this process. And so it is not an accident, or it's not a malfunction of the design that the vesica piscis is as small as it is, because it's literally a vulva. It's the place that new life emerges from.
It seems like a difficult way to experience nostalgia for unity with Source while we travel this journey to Christ consciousness, creating something for the universe.
So obviously it's difficult, and obviously we signed up for it. And the difficulty for us is that we experience life in these just tiny little chunks of 70 to 80 or 90 years, but we're eternal beings. And so again, to use the metaphor of the woman in labor, during labor, I'm sure many mothers among you said, I'm never going to do this again. And still 2 years down the time, you say, I need a companion for my baby, or I really want another child. And so why do we forget? We forget. And not because we don't remember the pain, perhaps, but that we are celebrating the extraordinary kind of blessing that we've ushered into life. And so it's very important to realize that our experience of pain is limited to 70 to 80 year segments in an eternity of the love of God. So sign up for if you go to the doctor to get a shot, sign up for the prick and realize it'll be over in 10 seconds.